So I've been curious about this for a while. I know that Ian Michaud is on record as your best friend, but I am curious as to how you met and how that relationship has persisted over time.
Yeah, so Ian and we actually met playing basketball at St. Edward's in South Austin, fall of 2010.
Mm.
And I always like to say that Ian, while he's like 6'4", 200 something, he's one of the best point guards I ever played with. But we actually never played a competitive college game together. He got hurt that year, had surgery on his ankle, and ended up transferring out. But so we only spent 1 year together on campus, but we stayed in touch. And then he's a huge LeBron James fan. I'm a huge Spurs fan. So we would talk a lot of crap to each other throughout 12, 13, 14, where those two teams were, or LeBron and Miami. Ian is team LeBron. Because I like to give him a lot of crap for kind of being a mercenary fan. But then he moved, kind of went to a couple of different colleges. Again, like I said, we stayed in touch. And then he moves back to Austin, I want to say 2015. He's been back and forth between his home state of New York. He was born in that Albany area. And so it was a friendship kind of birthed out of, I know I need to be PG Zach here, crap talk between each other
Mhm.
for like
Hoop talking.
5 or
Yeah.
6 years. Yeah. And then once he moved back to Austin, we kind of lived near each other. Obviously, we would play pickup. We had some rec teams. And then as soon as the team got announced here, Austin FC right there, I think he was actually living in New York at the time, but was planning on moving back down here. And I needed somebody to go in on tickets with me. And so he did. And then mid-season 22, because, we came in, we're basketball guys. We didn't really know much about soccer, even though both of us played. I think Ian played a little bit longer than I did. I was like, hey, man, I want to, I think sometimes our back and forth can be a little bit entertaining. Like I think most sports bros think their conversations could be entertaining for other people. So I convinced him to give the podcast a try with me. And there are at least tens of people that find our conversations interesting. So yeah, man, it's just kind of, it was birthed out of kind of just what you see on the North End podcast, where it's us two kind of bickering and bantering back and forth with each other. And so, yeah, man, it's blossomed into a lovely friendship, and I would put my life on the line for my guy E there, and
Oh
I
wow.
think he would do the same. Yeah, it's when you know somebody that long, and I know I'm relatively young still, et cetera, but he's been through a lot. I've been through a lot in the time that we've known each other, and been there for each other, supporting kind of just throughout our friendship. Yeah, man, he means a lot to me.
And we learned little weird things about you too here and there. Like he has talked about a 3 beer half before. That sounds
Oh yeah.
alarming. How does he pull that off, and how much game time does he actually miss in executing a 3 beer half?
Yeah, so I mean, there's multiple ways that we go about that. Number one, he executes it by me being the designated driver of us two.
Okay.
The only nights where I get a 3 beer happen, that's where like my lovely fiance Annabelle is picking us up from the stadium or something like that. And I mentioned 6'4", 210, 215. I think on a bad year, I know he's gonna be upset at me for saying 210, 215, because I know he just got down under 200 for the first time in a long time. But yeah, I mean, that guy he can put a lot away, whether it's drinking beers, whether it's eating, doing anything. Yeah. When we have some friends in the North End, because they only sell you so many beers, right? So
Right.
I can be good for one going up there with them. But, we've met a lot of friends along the way sometimes. I could shout out a handful of folks who will stop by just to say what's up, and they will come and hand us a beer, which again is it's pretty crazy to just like meet people through us again bloviating and throwing that out there onto the internets and making friends to the point where people want to buy us. And it's not just like, right, Phil, like everybody listening to this knows, it's not just like they're going out and giving us a 250 Lone Star, right? You're giving us a $12 Michelob Ultra or something like that. So man, that kind of stuff means a lot. And people could kind of say they are also contributing to those 3 deer
Mhm.
halves for Ian.
This is why you do a podcast, right? This is where the
Yeah.
payoff is. Yeah. I did have one I did have one question, because I do try to listen to as many of the podcasts as possible, because I'm a sicko like that, as you are as well, I know. What You have the most jock jammy theme, I think, of any of the podcasts. And I'm wondering where it comes from. I am curious now to know where you found that.
First of all, Jock Jams, that takes me back. And
Mm-hmm.
I think Volume 3 was my favorite as a kid, Phil.
Oh my God. You have a favorite.
Yeah.
You have, this explains a lot.
Yeah, man. That is actually just I just went on to one of those sites that has stock audio clips and typed in, I don't remember what the site was. I don't remember exactly what I typed in, but it was something like, podcast intro or intro music or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like the third or fourth one I clicked on. I was like, all right, this will work for now. And it has stuck. And you're the only person who has commented. I'm not saying that it's like the best intro ever, but it's not bad. And the fact that you're asking about this, like, I've been considering, like, do we need to change it up? 'Cause we have a big moment with the team, like after the win against San Jose, I think it was when they first, or it was at least when I first noticed that Godzilla Dillo video with the Pharaoh Monch song, or just like the instrumental of Simon Says under it. Like, I love that song. Ian's also partial to it, and we've known it for a long time. And so, like, when things like that happen, team goes on a good run. We have this track that kind of like fits with our mood at the time. We'll swap that in as a little theme song. And I think it's maybe one of many things why we could never monetize our YouTube, because we've got all this copyrighted content in like almost every episode. But
I was going to
yeah,
say,
man,
occasionally you flaunt copyright law.
exactly. That track, man, that we use for the normal intro and outro, it's just some random track I found, and it worked out pretty well.
That's amazing. Yeah, you can do that, or you can also commission a theme song.
Emergency podcast. Better did a thing, so we gotta talk about it. Emergency podcast. It's an emergency. Emergency podcast. Shut up, oh yeah, shut up, oh yeah, shut up. Emergency podcast. It's an emergency.
Hey, a hearty hello to you all, and welcome to Emergency Podcast, the Austin FC podcast where we talk about all emergencies throughout the season, even weeks in which tumbleweeds blow through St. David's Performance Center as nothing is happening. It is an international break. A few of our players, current and future, are playing right now or not playing, sitting on the bench. I was very disappointed to listen to Vuvuzelas for no reason yesterday with Ghana playing Mali, but we're going to talk a little bit about some nerdy number crunching, and I have one of the best people in Austin to do that with me right now from the North End podcast, as you are probably surmised. It's Zac Graham. How you doing?
Phil, I'm doing great. Refreshed after we took our first bye week on the North End podcast in pod history this week, but I couldn't stay away. 5 days is enough for me. So
right.
I'm here with you, and I do think it's interesting to me. I don't know what it means, but I find it interesting that I get to show up on Emergency Podcast when I think it is the least amount of emergency. We're like a week on either side for a game. All the green smoke is in the past. We're looking for new rumors. Like the only emergency here is that I'm on the Emergency Podcast. I guess.
See, the branding works. Well, we do. Absolutely. So we're going to get into some nerdiness that we've been attracted to in the last few days. Kind of got reminded about it by Gonzalo Pineda actually being let go as Atlanta United coach. And this harkens back to the days of the striker when Sam Jones talked to Atlanta United's architect Garth Lagerwey about a kind of philosophy that he has in terms of player mixes. So we're going to get into that. Zac has done some incredible number crunching on a Google sheet and reminded us of some of the players of which is pretty interesting set of names to revisit. So we're going to do that. But first, with the person who might be one of the more positive podcasters in the Austin FC media multiverse, wanted to talk a little bit about how you think the season's going so far. We're hitting the mailbag. I have some questions about that, and that's going to go up. Well, by the time this publishes, it will probably be up, at least the first part. There might be a kind of semi-emergency mailbag part 2 podcast happening in a few days, ... to be continued. But Zac, let's talk about the season and where your expectations were at the outset and what you're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of expectations at the outset, we've made a big deal through the first half of this season that we were the second most positive or rosiest prediction, because Primo from We Are Austin TV and the Top Flight podcast he beat us out. He said we were going to finish at 6th. We had Austin FC in 7th, and currently sitting in 6th and 7th in the West in points per game. So not too bad, primo in the North End. But Phil, that was a end of season prediction. Like the summer window comes through, we do enough to kind of hang around, and we kind of scratch and claw our way to a 7th place finish. The fact that this team has banked as many points as they have throughout the first part of the season is fantastic. But like, I cannot completely eject 100% of the recency bias from my brain, because I think that's a little bit irresponsible if you're trying to have, a well thought out viewpoint on this team. We know our buddy Profe likes to say MLS stands for, matters little until September. I think that is certainly the case. The West is going to be a bloodbath here, for lack of a better term, in the standing, I think, right up until Division Day. And coming off one of the worst losses, certainly scoreline wise, and to the eye test in that first half, I think going into this break, a lot of fans are feeling a little bit down about the prospects. I don't think that is necessarily misguided, because you look at the absences we have coming up for Copa America, the teams where like the schedule fluctuates. I was not, a month into this season, not super nervous about NYCFC coming to town in July, or Charlotte in the middle of the month. And now both of those teams, and Pigeons, one of the hottest teams in the league, Charlotte kind of in Austin FC type of fashion out east, not scoring a ton, but not giving up a ton, and they're sitting in 5th. So it's going to be a bumpy ride, I think, coming in here into the summer window, but you can see that light at the end of the tunnel, because over the last month, it's not just that the idea that we could be bringing in these big pieces, not just to help for the rest of this season, but towards the future of this team and what Rodolfo Burrell, what his vision is. Now that we have Desler confirmed and we have Bukhari very quickly, rumor to report to confirmation from the team, I'm still feeling really good, because at the end of the day, all I wanted from this season is a playoff berth and to see improvement. February 25, I know I'm very long-winded here and getting ahead of myself, but February 25, I expect this roster to be competitive for trophies. Not necessarily winning, because there's still only one team can win the league. Only one team can win Open Cup, Leagues Cup, this and that. But yeah, man, I'm feeling good. I think if that RSL match would have came a month ago and we're still sitting right where we are right now, we'd all be feeling even better about this team. So I think that what the club has done through the first 17 matches of this season, I think, is to be commended.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, one thing that obviously we didn't see coming was that they were going to have to hit the eject button on Rigoni's contract. 11 appearances happened, a 12th could not happen. And then all of a sudden we get this very, very surprising news about Rigoni. Like, I figure that both of us probably thought that he wasn't going to last past the season. We probably thought, oh, it's a normal contract and there's a normal club option at the end of the season, and he'll probably be gone at the end of that. But to see this happen now, what was your initial reaction when you saw the news on that, and just kind of thinking about the aftermath?
Didn't really know what to think at first, kind of that like 45-minute to an hour period from the first, the Bogert tweet that said that the buyout or placing on waivers, right, was the wording initially.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Right.
First thing I do when something like that happens is I open the rules and regulations page and, do a quick little search, go look at waivers and that process and what it means. And we kind of very quickly figured out, okay, this is going to be a buyout. Why now? Right? Like that, I think that was my biggest question after E and myself. And I will shout out the boys from the Verde Pendant, because that is a very active group chat here. We can call that the North Independent. I think those 5 of us in a group chat together. So figuring it out with those guys.
That sounds fun.
Our question was why now? And we fire up the live stream, because when big stuff like that happens, that's one thing that E and I like to do, is kind of just go and maybe word vomit our feelings out there and try to give Austin fans that interaction right when big news happens, whether it's a super draft pick or the schedule drop, or a $2+ million buyout on one of our designated players.
So an emergency live stream, as it were.
Exactly. And then once Bogert drops the news that it was an appearance clause, then it all makes sense. And then my ire shifts once again to our former sporting director. And that's where, like, you said a minute ago, jokingly, like, we assumed it was a normal contract. That's when it was like, okay, none of these contracts signed in the Reina era are safe on the surface. And I think Roto he did a lot in his press conference, as he normally does, to kind of like settle me and center me as a fan. But when he said some of those contracts, the bad parts in them, those little surprises that were left, that some of those are in the past, I'm hoping that means Alex Ring. I'm hoping that means like a guy like Jassy Zardes isn't going up another, $250,000 next year if they don't
Could be.
him. But
It could be.
again,
Could be.
I'm Ring.
Yeah, I mean, because I asked him that question right off the bat. I asked about, I wanted to confirm, first of all, that, I mean, Bogert is pretty spot on in terms of his reporting, but I wanted to just confirm indeed that was the reason, that was the clause. And then I had, at the end, put the little thing in there about, what other surprises did your predecessor leave you? And his face was just, everybody burst out laughing. I was like, oh, was that like question 2 forward or something like that? But it was everybody reacting to his face and then him saying lots of surprises. So, yeah. And again, I don't kind of understand what the rationale of that, if he's just trying to be player friendly or what the impetus was. But again, to have a clause like that, we can probably both agree is pretty ridiculous. And it's good to be rid of that contract, even though, obviously nice guy. And obviously, oh yeah, it's one less winger. And, Rigoni wasn't able to necessarily do a lot in the way of DP production, but in terms of being a warm body who could play wing, he was that, and we don't have that now. And obviously getting into this patch of the season before Bukhari comes and before they can do other kind of moves in summer transfer window, it's going to be thin. It's going to be dicey. I talked to Wolf about it and had asked him after the last game, if you dress 15, you dress 15. And he's like, yeah, I mean, he's not going to elevate like a Farker Lund or a Micah Burton just because they need to fill out a match day 20. It seems like they're going to roll with as many players as Wolf thinks deserve to be out there. And if that means that there's only 3 or 4 outfield subs, that's what they go with, which is terrifying.
Yeah. And I think too, like, it's not just Coach Wolf who's making those decisions, right? Like, I imagine Roto is maybe even the primary voice in that room, because he's watching the FTO matches, and I assume Coach Utley's staff is somewhat involved in those decisions as well. And so, like, what I love, like, did I catch Jimmy Fever back in early February? Absolutely. Especially because we got to watch that performance against the Galaxy out there. Coachella, I know you were there in person watching it, right?
Yep.
And would I love to see him and a number of those other FCTO guys come up and be able to even just, be on the bench, as some of them have, especially earlier in the regular season. But I also trust what this front office is doing right now, because that's what I'm going to give Rodolfo Borrell the benefit of the doubt until he gives me a reason to actually doubt him. And he has done the complete opposite thus far. I'm not sure what I would knock him for right now. I think probably the Kolmanich extension, because I don't really get it unless he's using it. Again, I think you've talked about it on the emergency pod before, where like maybe he's using that to, again, have control over the player, be able to get something back if they were to transfer him. But that's really the only head scratching move for me. And that's pretty good.
It's funny though, there are some fans out there that are really critical that he hasn't kind of delivered this home run player yet, or are questioning some of the moves he's made. But I mean, if you look and you see kind of the value that he's gotten for what he can do in the contract, kind of range of salaries that the team can afford right now, I mean, I'm really impressed with what he's been able to do, in the bargain bin, as it were, right? So, which is a little derogatory maybe when you consider that, Brendan Hines-Ike is on 200,000 or a little bit less than that.
-8.
-8, which is, I kind of want to know why that particular number. Biru's on 200,000. I mean, it's a case where you get players in that are not that much of a drain in terms of salary, but seem to be performing at an outsized rate to what they're being paid, which is good, because on the other side of that, Hedges' contract is a little more club friendly now, but you still have that. You have Zardes, you have, Väisänen's on a pretty high number for what he's been able to do fighting through the injuries and all that. So You want to, at the end, make it work. It's still a salary cap league with all sorts of weird rules, which I'm sure you have bookmarked, as I do. So that rules and regulations that you talked about. And then, of course, the MLSPA site and the CBA. But just kind of thoughts about that in terms of what he's been able to get, kind of the limitations that he's had, and just in terms of contracts that are welded into place for now, and then obviously the league rules.
Yeah, I think one thing that even the national pundits, and not really to any fault of their own, because it's really tough to keep up as much as guys like you and I do, and anybody else in the space who is just so honed in on Austin FC. I don't even think those guys, because I know like a Joe Lowry or a Tom Bogert, those guys, were kind of left scratching their heads to their, like, at their own, they've said it on multiple podcasts that there wasn't a lot done in the winter window. And I get that, but, then those guys aren't locked into every single, hanging on every word of a Burrell press conference where he's giving you that 2 to 3 window timeline for him to remake this roster. And I think that patience, we're about to see the first portions of that patience paying off here in the summer window, because could he have gone out and brought in more sheer numbers for the roster to start the season? Absolutely. But obviously he wants to make a little bit of a splash, bringing players over from Europe during this summer window, and retaining some of that flexibility throughout a rebuild is key in any league with a salary cap structure. I think we are seeing the benefit that kind of headed into the summer window, where there are a number of avenues, depending on how much GAM he has in the coffers, depending on how much some of these things we still don't know, like how much TAM are we having to allocate to a Leo Väisänen, to a Johan Valencia, guys like, all of these TAM players. Going forward, I know there was a kind of a multifaceted question there, but what is, like, to me, and I'm an easily excitable person. Like, when there is a ceiling possibility for something like, we could have enough TAM to buy down Alex Ring and bring in an extra, or not an extra, but another DP in this window. And because of the rule changes, that can be, now there is no more full DP by July 18th when those new rules are expected to come into place. And that decouples
And a second buyout.
and your 22s. Exactly. You get that second buyout. So, like, you could buy down Alex Ring with the TAM, bring in another DP with no financial or no, TAM constraints with that 1.65 million or somewhere in there. You could use that second buyout on Giassi Zardes if, Tony Precourt and crew are willing to spend that money now. You can now get at least 2 more U22 players, assuming on June 30th, Moussa Jite have a new home, whether it's a loan for these final 6 months or a transfer. And I think that's where I'm most excited about this window and in the offseason, is that we've seen what Roto can do with, to what you said, those bargain bin guys. And I don't, there's no offense there. That is what it is. We can all see the salaries and what Roto is doing, the type of value he's bringing in that. Those 4 field players, so you've got Obi and Biru and Rubio and who's the 4th one? Heinzike. Those guys are right around 1.3 million, which if you go over to the Galaxy salary, you see that Claudio left a surprise in Fagundez's contract where he's now making 1.3 million for the Galaxy. So we've got 4 right now starting players, guys who are in that starting 11. If everybody's healthy, I'm pretty sure all 4 of those guys are playing at the moment for the salary of Diego Fagundez. So again, this is where, when we fired up our emergency live stream when the Fagundez trade happened, we were very excited at the possibility of this from the financial perspective, the team building perspective, because I think that's where certainly I and Ian as well get very, like, nerdy excited with it, because I love building rosters, and especially under constraints, whether it's like I'm building a fantasy team, right, which is more of like the everyday average Joe aspect of roster building, or like I spent 9 years as a college basketball coach and building teams like that under various rules, whether you have scholarships available to you or not. If you're at the D3 level, you have different hurdles to overcome in that sense. So you can see that some of the, well, you probably can't see it, but there's a couple championship rings over my shoulder. So again, I fancy myself a roster builder. And so, like, watching what Roto is doing, I'm very, very pleased so far.
Yeah, just the way that he's done it too. You get Obrian in the reentry draft, and he moves up to number one of that. I think just because he can, not that he needed to necessarily, but
Right.
just kind of a little bit of flexing maybe. And then obviously you get Rubio as a free agent. You get Heinz Eich. Obviously he had been cut in kind of a weird, DC United exodus that happened at the end of their season. So yeah, I mean, I think it's very kind of smart in terms of, and that ability to kind of build within the league too, because I think that's one thing that people have been concerned about when Burrell came over. Everybody kind of fancied Sean Rubio as this kind of MLS whisperer and able to do those kind of moves. And Burrell in a press conference asking about that, I think right after the Rubio move had happened, basically said, "Oh yeah, we have people in place to handle that. We're fine."
Right.
So they figured out pretty quickly how to deal with those kind of roster rule restrictions and all that. Although that's obviously kind of the biggest challenges, right? So akin to building a best ball team and then sitting helpless as your second draft pick has been traded to Cruz Azul, where you cannot, unfortunately, get any goals and assists, since that is a different league that he is now playing in.
The good thing if we can take a little basketball tangent here, because Yorgos is now officially in another league, you can replace him with somebody. So we'll have to talk about that after we've been.
Oh, nice. Okay, I thought I had to wait till summer. No.
Yeah, so that's, again, with me kind of creating this league from scratch and never having to actually replace anybody last year. If you're officially in another league, you can replace somebody outside the transfer window.
Oh, so beautiful. Okay.
Back on track.
Do I get Olivier Giroud at this point?
I guess you could put in a discovery rights claim on him or something. We'll have to write those rules as we go.
Do we have those? Do we have discovery right claims? Oh, that's awesome.
Hey, we can. You're talking to the commish. But like,
what's this list of 40 names from Phil? Look,
right. So just like to finish up on your question,
for sure.
The most exciting thing, and I know I'm talking about, I'm excited about this, and Roto's so great, but we've seen what he's done with those value signings, and he has not to this point. Obviously, we've got Bukhari in house now, so there's boom, one DP, but we haven't seen him on the field yet. So we're about to see some TAM signings from Roto, right? I think probably Desler gets over that number, but maybe not. He could be right on that edge.
Yeah, I feel like he's
Bukhari, right? Yeah, Bukhari, DP slot, Desler, probably TAM. Open U22s, ring, either in the summer or the winter, probably going to get replaced in terms of the DP slot. Maybe he sticks around on a different deal. But what can Roto do with the specialized roster slots? Because the DP and the U22 slots, and of course TAM to a bit of a lesser extent, to me are where you win this league. And of course, I don't want to forget, the depth pieces you can have on a supplemental roster, especially your homegrown guys that don't count against the cap. There are so many different ways to build an efficient roster in the league, which is kind of, again, why I'm in love with it. But man, you look at a team like Columbus. Columbus has 15 senior roster players right now, and they almost they could have won the CONCACAF Champions Cup. And I don't want to discount their run because I know they didn't look great, and it's also not probably a good look that they're all like, oh, well, we all had, bubble guts coming into that game. We weren't feeling good. So that's can be seen as an excuse. But what they did to get to that point, right, with only 15 senior roster players, that is great roster building. And Columbus now losing kind of their mastermind in the last 24 hours.
I was just going to say,
them and Philly, those types of roster builds, I think, are what Rodolfo is looking at and trying to model this club after. And then what can he do even on top of that from the academy levels, the next pro levels, again, but all that stuff takes time. And this is a what have you done for me lately business in terms of your relationship with most fans. And so, I do understand the impatience and frustration from some, but I'm strapped in, man. I'm ready to keep riding this rebuild.
Yeah, and you're right. Just to get one point before we get into the kind of fun roster stuff that we wanted to talk about from Lagerway and Atlanta United, just the idea is that DPs have to perform, right? Like why is RSL and why are Miami challenging for the Shield right now? Look at Chicho's numbers, look at Messi's numbers, look at Suarez's numbers. That is why DP production is absolutely what separates those Shield caliber teams from your mid-level playoff teams to teams that are struggling. And
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
look at Austin right now, and I mean, it's, you look at, obviously Rigoni's gone. Ring isn't a kind of traditional attacking player. So kind of a curious place to have that DP spend, and then look at Driussi's numbers and kind of where they are relative to where he was 2 years ago.
Yeah, and I think that's I don't want to be the one, and I think there's been plenty of people who have kind of raised their eyebrows at Seba and his lack of production relative to the salary that he got,
Hmm.
right? Because he's like fifth or sixth in the league still in terms of that individual salary, and just the rates are still good, but they're not great, and we're paying him like an MVP caliber
Hmm.
player, and he can't really stay on the field. Like over the last calendar year, think it's at least 3 absences now for those soft tissue, lower body issues, so I'm a little concerned there with the Bukhari signing, the Desler signing. There's this new window, I think, that Roto is kind
Hmm.
of building this the core of this team.
Yeah.
2027 expiration, 2028 team option. I think we're going to see a number of contracts signed in the next year that have that similar end date with those top end roster spots, your DPs, your TAMs, 22s.
Right. Yeah. So it's going to be interesting to see. Obviously, summer window. We're very excited to see what comes from that, and obviously heading into the rest of the season, hopefully June will not be as painful as it very well could be. So let's go ahead. I want to talk about this kind of roster building concept, which is called 9+2. That equals 11, of course, the number of players that you can have on the field. But Zach, if you want to kind of introduce it, and then I can maybe kind of fill in with some of what I know, and then we can talk about Austin and how 9+2 is kind of manifested this year and maybe notably in previous seasons.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, from my understanding, reading what your buddy J. Sam Jones put out there about this, and some of what he has talked to Garth Lagerwey about this concept, 9+2 is what Atlanta uses in their front office to kind of measure how they are able to rotate specifically in the first half of the year, where their data set that they have 9 of their what they consider starting caliber players, right? So that can be
Hmm.
more or less than 11 on a roster.
Right.
And I think it can be subjective depending on which team you're looking at, who is actually doing the categorizing, which we can get into in a minute, that the results don't really fall off significantly if you have two, rotation type depth pieces or like inexperienced slash young players. 9 starting caliber guy, 2, others, I guess as we can call them. The results seem to be, positive from 9+2 on up to, if you have 11 starting caliber guys out there, you're feeling good. But the drop off from 8.8+3 and then 7+4 or mores is stark, and it is drastic, and you see that in the numbers for Atlanta. And I know the recent 9+2 article that, or I think that just came out this week with Pineda's firing, was J. Sam Jones saying, look at the number of non-9+2 or better games that Pineda had. It was pretty incredible, the amount of injury luck in a negative sense that Atlanta had over the last 2 seasons. And of course, as soon as that article comes out and you and a couple of our other friends in a certain Slack chat get a hold of this 9+2 concept, then we're in there, we're debating, for the Austin side, who's starting caliber, who's bench depth, this and that throughout the years. So I don't know how good of a job I did explaining that, but essentially it's what Atlanta uses, right, to make sure they are getting proper rotation, experience for the young players, rest for their veterans, and maintaining that 9+2 or better to make sure that they have a strong enough team out there in the field to compete game in and game out. Obviously, the best laid plans, yada, 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 but that is their goal with this type of metric or exercise.
Yeah, I think you described that really well. And again, yeah, that kind of idea, I think the important thing to emphasize is that it's not just who are your regular 11 starters. It's this kind of idea of starting caliber that you can plug those players in and you have a certain expectation of performance, versus with veteran or bench depth. Obviously, you can absorb a few of those in the mix, but if you have too many of those, then that can definitely show. And I immediately, when I looked at the chart, I immediately went to the opener against Minnesota, because I still maintain that first half is the worst first half of the season, maybe the worst first half that Austin has ever played in its Warrior history. And what's that number? What were they rolling with that day?
Yeah, 7+4 or more, and that's only one of two times. One of two times this year.
And to be clear, let's see. So the 4 that were not starting caliber, it was
I
we're
believe
considering.
Finley, Valencia, Zardis, Coleman, I think.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. So we're considering basically Ring and Wolf and Pereira as kind of your starting caliber midfielders, right?
Yeah, and again, this is where it comes back to this exercise, especially when fans are doing it, that it's subjective, because I
Mhm.
know that there's a large swath of the fan base would look at me saying that Owen Wolf is starting caliber and say some nasty things. And it changes year to year too for some of these guys, Phil, because
Yep.
think about like 2022 Ethan Finley. You can see on my chart I have him starting caliber there. I think this year he's kind of far from that in my eyes.
Yeah.
And I'm also trying to factor in a little bit of what I thought the club would think of these guys. I waffled on a guy like Rodney Redis in 2021 because I think he was signed to come in and play and be a starter. But if you go through the game logs, they figured out very quickly that he was not a starting caliber player. So I ended up putting him as bench depth. But yeah, it's again, I think I tried to get some feedback for this from some of our buddies, and I got a couple opinions and tried to factor those in. We could talk about this all day. I'll pass it back to you for some more direction.
Yeah, but looking at the 2024 season, one of the things that really stands out to me, and again, it's obviously the starting caliber group has grown a little bit with Bakari and Dessler, who we haven't even seen yet, but Biru has certainly, I think, elevated himself pretty quickly to starting caliber, which is where you have him there. I think that's legitimate. Gallagher's still starting caliber. Again, I think he's kind of struggled with the instructions that he's had this year to be more of a defensive fullback and not get so far forward, and obviously a little bit of injuries of late, but you do see, I think, enough out of him to still consider him that starting sort of player. But yeah, it is a little nebulous on some of them, maybe between, whether you're starting or whether you're veteran slash bench depth. But looking at the numbers that you've got here, and I think this is interesting, that only 5 of those first 17 games, you have 8.3 or 7.4, right? Or, anything kind of below that. And I think 7.4 is probably the worst that it's been. Like, they haven't had to roll out, God forbid, a 6+5 lineup yet.
Yeah.
But in terms of thinking about the first half of the season and banking points and things like that, I think that makes sense. I mean, it's weird that when they were at quote unquote full strength, where they didn't have any of those veteran bench depth guys in the lineup, they won 1 and lost 2 of those games. But overall, they've seemed to, from the looks of this, roll out pretty consistently strong lineups with that formula. And I think we're seeing that in the amount of points that they've been able to get so far this season.
Yeah, absolutely. You can see kind of in the flow of this first half of the chart here this season that slow start, and we're starting out with 7+4s, 8+3s, and as we trickle towards the 9+2s, the 10+1s, that's when those threes start to pop up in there, right? And the team starts stringing together some wins when they get a little bit healthier. Now you're kind of, coming back into like Portland. We had an 8+3, obviously lost that game in the midweek. And then it was a 9+2 against RSL. But this is another point that I want to bring up about this exercise, is that this doesn't take into account the quality of the starter that is out, because with the way Austin's roster is built, Sebastian Driussi missing a game is much more impactful than if, Emiliano Rigoni doesn't start, as we saw in some of these results. If Owen Wolf is on the bench, right? Like, Driussi has a much bigger impact on that. So, like, some of the extra hurdles that happen in the reality of these matches aren't factored in here. And again, so like, this is not some perfect metric. It's not some perfect science, but even with those flaws in this process, we can talk about the overall numbers season by season, or just kind of for the 4 or 3+ years for the club as a whole in a minute. But like, there's also positional hurdles that aren't factored in. So like, even though in 2023, I still had Alex Ring as a starting caliber player, Alex Ring at center back, you probably wouldn't consider that specific position for Alex Ring to be starting caliber. I sure wouldn't. But from what I know about this process in Atlanta, they don't necessarily adjust for that. Alex Ring is on the field. He's a starting caliber player. So no matter where he plays, we're going to count him in this process. So I think even some of the 2023 numbers, which do back up this process, where like you see, we struggle because we have the most 8+3 and 7+4s combined of any season. We only had 1 11 plus 0 in the 2023 season. Those numbers could look even worse if you did factor things like that in, where you're starting somebody completely out of possession.
Right. And I think there's been like 6 games where Driussi hasn't played this year, and Austin hasn't won any of them. So that's probably an indication to his importance, even though we're not necessarily maybe seeing his contributions in the numbers that we might like. Certainly him being on the field is a big difference maker. Yeah, I did want to point out the 23 season, because obviously a lot of injuries, the groin demon year, all those sorts of things. Yeah, so there's 14 of the 34 different games in which Austin was rolling with 8.3 or less, right? Quick note, it's actually 13. So that is kind of an indication of maybe where the season went. And a lot of those games, like even in that kind of difficult stretch in the back half of the season, were 9+2 games, right? So the only time you had full strength against Portland, which was still a pretty heartbreaking loss, and I think maybe even compounded just by being full strength. And then obviously the game against Dallas away, which we will probably not want to ever talk about again. That was a 10+1 game, right? So, but unfortunately, yeah, I mean, you did have, and again, that's the other thing that I'm kind of curious about too, is just, it doesn't really account necessarily for who you're subbing in, right? It's just who you're starting, and you're expecting kind of starter level minutes from those players. If an injury happens in the game, then obviously that can kind of tilt things towards being on the wrong side of that 9+2 equation.
Yeah, absolutely. You're just looking at that starting 11 when you're doing this exercise. But to your point about 2023, from the way I categorize these players, we've had 10 games in club history with 7+4 or more. So like the worst possible, right? You're not expected to win any of these games. 5 of those 10 in club history came last year. And if you're just looking at sub 9+2 games, 13 of the 33 in club history came last year. So more than a third, right?
Wow. Yeah.
So again, you didn't need this chart to know that Austin had below average injury luck in 2023, but it does, I think it's a nice little visual and statistical aid to kind of confirm a little confirmation bias, maybe, that like we had below average luck last year. And then you look in 2022, we had 9 11+0 games. There's 20 in the history of the clubs. Like half of them came in that magical season. And you look in that one as well, you only had 2 7+4 or more games. And there was some luck involved there. Danny Pereira gets us all 3 points in Charlotte with a completely rotated line there of the 7+4 or more. They pull out a 7+4 or more, a draw at home against Nashville in that season. So again, a lot of luck, injury wise, and on the pitch, right? A lot of factors, or a lot of things that can play a factor in the luck, good or bad. And then bad luck in 2023. And throughout this season, I think we kind of saw the first half of the season like a sandwich. Like you had the bad bread on top, and we just got a little bit of that bad bread to end the first half. But man, the meat of this 2024 sandwich was pretty fun, man. Those 6 wins in an 8 or 9 game span there. That's good. I don't care which team you are in this league. That was a great 2-month stretch for this team.
Yeah, it is crazy looking at the 22 numbers again. So you've got 10 games where they were 8+3 or 7+4, and yet they got 14 points out of those 10 games.
Yeah.
I mean, that's absurd. Like that's almost a 1.5 being like so much less than full strength.
Yep. And so like if you're looking at, again, because the marker, right, for Lagerwey and Atlanta is that the difference between when you go from 9+2 to 8+3 and the fall off that happened there. If you look again, and I would encourage people who, again, are so inclined and have the time to go and do something like this, categorize the players for yourself and see what the numbers come out on your end. Because for me, you look at the 11+0s, 1.3 points per game for those. I think that is being drugged down a little bit by that first season, where I have guys like Jared Stroud and Musa Jite and Danny Hosen all categorized as starting caliber, because again, I think you have to adjust for the roster that you're looking at. In the grand scheme of MLS, that 2021 roster had 3.5 starting caliber players. Maybe I'm being so we're including guys like that, but then 10+1s, that is 40 games in the club's history, 1.45 points per game. 29 total games of 9+2, 1.41 points per game. Then you get to 8+3. 23 games in the club's history, 0.91 points per game, and 10 games of 7+4 or more, and that is 0.9 points per game. So you see that you're basically losing half point on your average going from 9+2 to 8+3 or worse. And so again, that's something that I'm going to probably continue to track stuff like this throughout the rest of my fandom, because I think this is a really cool way to be additive to the way you can explain a team's season in the league.
Yeah, and I mean, part of that is how you are wired, because that's
Yeah,
kind of what you do in
exactly,
your
for
day
sure.
job too. But it is really interesting. And yeah, again, and obviously, like, kind of the larger sample size you have, the better the data probably, right, in a lot of cases.
Absolutely.
So if you have, obviously, if you have a small sample size, anything can kind of be skewed. But yeah, I mean, just looking at some of these names, I mean, you had Ben Sweat, who I think like played maybe a game and a half. Like, I think he was,
Game and a
he
half,
was
yeah.
considered starting caliber when he was signed in 21. And obviously you have Romagna here as starting caliber, which I think
Yep.
kind of quickly dropped off. So
Exactly. He was not
Um,
that in 2022 in my charts.
right. Yeah. And then like the veteran bench depth, you have vaunted names like Manny Perez, Aiden Stanley, Mackenzie Gaines, Freddie Kleeman, right? So definitely,
Kekuta Mane.
players that would be, Mane's in there. right?
TST
So-
star.
Oh my God, that's right. That's happening. Yeah. It's just, I mean, it's amazing just to kind of see again. I mean, obviously difficult to build a expansion roster in the middle of a pandemic, but still just kind of thinking about where the team started and kind of the level of players that we had. And then all of a sudden just kind of seeing 3 years, the kind of incredible heights in terms of some of the signings, right? I mean, you have somebody
Mhm.
coming from Liga, and now you have somebody who's played in Champions League and did not start yesterday for Ghana, which I'm still bitter about, but is part of that roster for, again, they've had some difficulties of late, but traditionally one of the African powerhouses. So yeah, to me, I think it's just very interesting as an exercise, not only to kind of see where that happens, but also if you do have these kind of doldrum periods, that's a thing to look at, right? So just kind of looking
Mhm.
and seeing, okay, what do we have in terms of starting caliber players versus bench players that we're rolling out there, and factor that in and see, okay, over this stretch, like how is the team performing versus not? And
Mhm.
again, if the theory holds, and then the expectation is that once you're at 8.3, you are at a definite disadvantage. And if you can overperform that, then that's kind of part of the gritting out a good season, which can be in this league, obviously, the difference between playoffs and not.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, what is kind of skewing the data right now, where we have only 3.5 seasons of it, is 2021. Because, first of all, you look anything 8.8+3 or 7+4 or more, we got 0 points from those games in 2021. And we only
Right.
got 6 points from our 7 games where we had 11+0. So, like, those are like the perfect games where you should be 100% full strength, ready to go, being competitive. So if you take 2021 out of this data, then your 11+0 game go from 1.3 points per game to 1.53. So again, we are being held down a little bit still in these numbers. I think they would be even more drastic if you just take 22, 23 in the first half of 24.
If you do like say, okay, well, yeah, Romagna really never did elevate to starter level, or if you say, well, Ben Sweat never really elevated, and you skew the numbers that way, then that probably shifts things. And I think maybe that explains things a little bit better.
Absolutely. And if you're going to take somebody like Hector Jimenez in 2021 was on that line. And again,
Mhm.
I'm letting my opinion of what I think the front office thought and the coaching staff thought of these guys in a given year affect how I'm categorizing them as well. Because I think Hector at that point was brought in to be at least a rotational starter. And again, with that roster, the names that we've been over, it's just, it kind of skews things just a little bit. But again, like you said, the further this club goes in its short history, the more data we're going to have. And I think it's going to continue to show that, we need those 9+2s in there. And again, that's where the depth of this team that we can continue to build up, that's where this is just going to be ultra important going forward, because the better you get, as we saw last year, like the more competitions you're in. And we have never had the depth to really participate in multiple competitions. I think that is a goal, however far down the line it may be for Roto and team.
And also that this is, again, these are relative, right? This is not a measure of individual self-worth. This is thinking about starters relative to where the league is, where players' ages are, where they are with injury history and coming back from injuries and things like that. And that can all, I think, impact those kind of perceptions. And then plus, obviously in 2024, the league's better than it was in 2021, right? So you didn't have Messi and Suarez in the league in 2021, right? So
Yeah,
definitely when
absolutely.
you factor those things in, it's you have to kind of raise to a higher bar, I think, to be that starting caliber. Because again, it's not just starting on that team, but it's this kind of idea of, I think, league level starter is kind of what's baked into this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's where, again, I'm being a little bit generous on some of these years because in terms of like relative to the league, because, and I think there's obviously rosters around MLS that are in worse positions than we are here in Austin, where like I'm going to give a little bit of grace to somebody like Owen Wolf, who for other teams, I think he would probably start on 8 to 10 teams in the league, Austin being one of them right now, at least
Mhm.
rotational. But, on average, some of these guys, like, I don't know if Julio Cascante starts for half the teams in the league. I don't know about Leo Väisänen, partially because we haven't really seen him be able to stay healthy. Emiliano Rigoni, I think, is an MLS level starter, but in all of our minds, he's got that DP tag, so he's so disappointing. If we had Rigoni on 350K and he was just our kind of backup rotational left wing a la an Ethan Finley, I think we'd feel okay about him. But there's more context around some of these guys that, and again, it's some of this is just subjective, and I'm giving some of these guys the benefit of the doubt.
Right. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you doing this work and bringing this here. Cause I mean, it is a really interesting thing to look at, especially again, we don't oftentimes get a lot from Josh Wolf about what's going on. And these kind of things, I think, really help kind of piece together what clues we do get from time to time from the coach, from players, and then just kind of mining the data and seeing what's there. For me, looking at the numbers is a really important facet of what we do here. So really appreciate you doing that.
Yeah, no problem. And I'm right there with you. Looking at the numbers is something that we like to do, and of course, like the stats aren't everything, right? It is one factor in what goes into building a successful roster, and then you have to actually go out there, and the product on the field has to gel together and have success out there as well. But yeah, man, I really appreciate you having me on, Phil. I've been an admirer, not really from afar, because every time I see you in person, I always sprint up to you, make sure you know I'm there. Man, yeah, it was a joy to join you on the Emergency Podcast, Phil. And maybe if I get invited back in the future, maybe we will have an actual emergency to discuss.
I will keep that in mind. I will keep in mind, first of all, actually getting on if we have an emergency, but definitely you were a good voice to have in the mix there. Yeah. So before I let you go, just wanted to I mean, I'm sure people who listen to this know where to find you, but that, and then just kind of want to know about your plans for the coming weeks. And then obviously, I mean, there's going to be some kind of weird pockets in there with Leagues Cup and things like that. So if Austin does not advance beyond the group stage in Leagues Cup, I don't know if you planned out that far yet, but just kind of curious as to what y'all got in the mix.
Yeah, what do we have coming up? For North End Podcast, you go on Twitter is at the North End Pod, Instagram Threads is at the North End Podcast, so that's not confusing at all. Anywhere to get your podcast, YouTube if you want to see our pretty faces and pulling up some of these numbers, you can go to the northendpodcast.com. We try our hand at some match preview articles. We dabble in some of the MLS bets, which I know you like to take part in from time to time, whereas Moises, not so much.
Right.
But so we get some of those picks articles out there, and then we've got some spreadsheets that have, and maybe I should add these 9+2 sheets on there just for people to see and mess around with. But as much information as we have, or that the league has given us, that the team has given us, when it comes to the roster build, we've got a couple of Google sheets there that are available to the public. So I would encourage anybody who hasn't to check that stuff out, check us out. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about this Austin FC independent media space is there are so many voices. And like you said, you're a sicko. You try to listen to as much as you can. I do the same. And so, we're just another, we kind of have thrown our hat in the ring here. And we love that, a couple Austin fans like to rock with us. In terms of the rest of the summer, we like to have guests pop on from time to time. I bother Tom Bogert a ton. I think he is actually our most recurring guest, which is
Really?
crazy.
Nice.
Yeah, he's been on the North End 3 times now. So I try to
Okay.
give him at least like 6 months before I ever like message him, bother him again. But you never know who we could have on. Maybe you see Phil on there. We had Hernan from Top Flight We Are Austin TV on the live stream a month ago whenever that Rigoni stuff happened. And Leagues Cup break is actually where we last year, and I think we're going to do this again. We kind of run that Leagues Cup pick'em pool through the MLS site where they do it. But we gave the champion of our pick'em league last year for Leagues Cup an Austin FC jersey. It was the Las Voces kit last year. We'll put the Dillo kit out there. So, Leagues Cup break, the team might go on hiatus. And like we did this week, we may take a bye week for ourselves in there, take one of those Wednesdays off because we go twice a week. And it's a lot of talking. And I drag, shout out to E for me dragging him onto 2+ hours of content every week and him going along for the ride with me. But yeah, man, twice a week during the season, once a week in the off season. And we've got some stuff going on behind the scenes that may be able to kind of improve our product as well and what the content that we're putting out there for people. So that's about as much as I can say about that right now. But yeah, we're excited for the future here in the North End.
Okay, you don't have socks yet, right?
No, we don't yet, but I was talking to Landon, and now like every time I see Landon, I'm trying to see what the socks he has on. But I think they got those from Sock Club, and my younger sister, she was a designer for Sock Club for a couple
really?
years.
Nice.
So
Okay.
got a connection there. Yeah, and then born and raised in Austin, and so this club is extremely special to me as it is to I know a lot of other native Austinites feel that pull. But also just the connections and kind of the small world feel, because meet somebody random, whether it's somebody like Landon who will get recognized at any Austin FC event, or just any fan, a guy named Jesse who we met a couple weeks ago, one of those guys who brought us beers at halftime of the game a couple weeks ago. Like, and getting to know people and seeing where our Austin stories kind of intersect like that, I think is one of my favorite aspects of really just kind of expanding my own community here amongst the fan base. That has been one of the coolest things.
Well, awesome. Well, great to have you on, and I'm looking forward to someday sporting my Make It a 3 Beer Half North End podcast socks.
Where's Phil? He usually starts this off.
He's teaching in San Antonio today. Colby, go ahead and start us off.